I'm Joanne Freeman. I'm the author of The Field of Blood, Violence in Congress and the Road to Civil War, and you are watching Author's Voice.
Welcome to Author's Voice, connecting authors to the world. I'm Daniel Weinberg, and our show is A House Divided. And of course, we're in our studio here at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago, and happy that you're joining us on this late Saturday afternoon. You're probably done with your pre-Christmas shopping already, and you're watching us, and we're proud of that. If you're watching us on Facebook Live, use the comments button to submit a question. Give us your name and where you're from so we can give a shout out and say hello. And you can also order a signed book right now, actually. Go to authorsvoice.net and you get a first edition signed, and we'll send it directly to you. Now today we have really a wonderful book. I enjoyed this thing. I don't enjoy most of the books, but this is unusual because it was new information entirely. Joanne Freeman is an authority on early national politics and political culture, a professor of history and American studies at Yale University. How many years have you been there?
21.
21. And where did you get your degree before?
I got my PhD at UVA.
At UVA, okay. Go what, Bulldogs or who?
Wahoo.
Wahoo, okay. And what was your thesis on, by the way?
It was on the grammar of political combat in the first 10 years of the government. So how politicians fought on the national stage in the first 10 years of the government.
That would be an interesting, put this on the web for this so we can see that. She's the co-host on history podcast Backstory. She's the author of Affairs of Honor, National Politics in the New Republic, and the editor of the Essential Hamilton and Alexander Hamilton writings. Her latest book, The Field of Blood, Violence in Congress and the Road to Civil War. Farrar, Straus and Giroux, 450 pages, and it's illustrated, and it's $28. And I recommend this. You can get it right now and get a signed first edition, and we'll get it right out to you. And I hope you will do that because you're going to enjoy this, having it on your shelf, or at least on your bedstand first. So it must be nice to have John Meacham and James McPherson both give you, and two other Pulitzer winners, 4 Pulitzer winners on the back of this book. That's pretty cool. Historian Edward Ayers writes in here as well, your book chronicles a young America brawling its way toward war. And that's exactly what this was, and we'll be talking about that. But I want to get into something real quick. I asked Doris when she was sitting here a little over a week ago, Meacham, Beschloss, Goodwin, Brinkley, historians are literally in the news as historical talking heads on news channels. So has the newsroom become our new classroom? Or where else can Americans learn our history?
Well, for sure.
What do you think about this news?
I think we're in a, and you can define this in a lot of different ways. We're in a historical moment, right? We're in a moment when history matters, when the newscasters, people in the news are constantly talking about history. There are times in American history when the past has a particularly big role to play. And I think at moments of big change, that's really true. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think in books, and I think as pundits, and I think writing op-eds, and I think on social media, on Twitter, historians have a lot to say. And as a historian, if the public's interested in history, that's a good thing.
That's a good thing.
Yeah.
And we're historians here in the shop, and we feel the same way. There's a great deal to learn. And I'm glad there's a way easily watching the news, and all of a sudden you get a sidebar of context.
Yeah.
Not a bad thing. Now, in Appendix B,
wow, okay.
you have a note on your methodology,
yes.
All right? So it's a good place to start. How did you uncover unpleasantly personal discussions in Congress? How did you discover them in the first place? What were your sources? Because you write about triangulation.
Right. One of the underlying sort of unique things or special things about the topic, and you suggested it right at the outset, is much of the story that I'm telling here about physical violence in Congress, it's really a story that hasn't been told, and it hasn't been told because a lot of it was essentially censored out of the period's equivalent of the congressional record. So for me to find the violence, I had to dig around. And so I was using private letters, and I was using diaries, and I was using some databases, and I was getting little bits of information and triangulating or piecing things together to prove to my satisfaction that something had happened and that I sort of understood what the dynamics of it were.
So the modern technology of newspapers, this is just before the telegraph, so it couldn't go right out, but newspapers or pamphlets, did it get out to the public at all? Did they know about it as it was going along?
They did, and the telegraph happened smack in the middle of this story. So initially, the Washington press community is really small. It's a couple of people, and they sit in the House and the Senate, these reporters, and they take notes on whatever's going on. They check with the congressman to make sure that what they're saying is accurate. And then they would publish it in their newspapers, which were partisan, so they weren't trying to be objective. And then they would create the equivalent of a congressional record in a separate kind of a publication. So for a while, the news community was pretty insular, and so people didn't necessarily have a full sense of what was going on in Washington. Over time, as the press community gets bigger, and then the telegraph means you can have people from out of town in Washington, and they can telegraph stories home, the news begins to get out more. And as luck or lack of luck would have it, that's roughly the same time period as the slavery debate is intensifying. So both of those things are happening at the same time.
So how did you decide what was truthful and what ain't?
It was hard. And there are a number of things that aren't in the book because I ended up not feeling that I could prove to myself with satisfaction that they would count. For sure, I needed to have either more than one kind of evidence. So if I found it in a letter, I wanted to find it in a newspaper or find something in the record. I wanted to confirm things. Or I wanted so much evidence in one kind of form of evidence that I couldn't deny it. So for example, there was this incident that I read about in, there's a congressman from Ohio named Joshua Giddings, and Giddings writes in his memoir of sorts about standing up and giving a speech, an anti-slavery speech. He was an abolitionist, and having several different congressmen stand opposite him with guns, ready clearly to shoot him, deciding ultimately not to. But he describes this really fraught moment, right? And then he says a couple other men came and stood by his side, and it's the most gunpowder in one incident happens as he describes it in his memoir. Well, I loved the story, right? So for years, I was like, I gotta find a way to tell the story. But with just his memoir, I couldn't, that wasn't enough. He would have any number of reasons to want to make Southerners look bad in his memoir as an abolitionist. So I looked and I looked and I looked, and finally towards the end of my research process, I found in an obscure newspaper, actually in two obscure newspapers, two reporters who said they saw this one particular man stand up and cock a gun and say something about, I'm gonna kill that guy. And I sang hallelujahs because then it meant, oh, okay, I have outside verification that this happened.
Are these things, we're going to get to this a little bit later, I have some questions for that, but is this because of modern technology today? You can get to and uncover all this? Because if the Globe censored it, that's what most historians were going to for their history, because newspapers, you couldn't get to all of them.
Right, and that's one of the amazing things about this book, and I'm the sort of person who loves to go to archives and look at the real stuff and look at the real manuscripts. That said, I couldn't have done this without databases, because I could sit at my desk and online get the entire congressional record, or the equivalent of it, online go to a database and check what the press coverage of what I was looking at was, online go to Google Books and find the memoirs of the congressman who I was writing about. That's pretty amazing. So without that ability, I don't know if I could have confirmed what I'm writing about in the book. Now that said, I did a lot of archive hopping because a lot of the people I write about in this book are obscure. So they didn't leave behind memoirs or autobiographies, and their papers largely haven't been digitized because they weren't highly significant individuals, which of course made it more fun because then I got to wander around doing research.
Yeah, but so you can't rely on the internet alone. It could be overused and miss a great deal.
Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, that the danger, so there's wonders and wonderful things about doing online research and database research. The downside of that is you ask for something and it explicitly gives you that thing. You don't see what's around it. you don't have the serendipity of stumbling across other things in the same way that you do when you're rummaging around and doing research. So it's very possible, you're looking at things through a very narrow hole when you're looking in a database. So you can miss a lot of things.
Well, the centerpiece of this book is the diaries, I guess, of Benjamin French, who had a very interesting career. He was front and center to the violence in Congress. First of all, how did you assess his veracity to begin with? Because diaries can be good or bad or overblown or too spare, and you don't know.
No, it's true. So, and that was I guess like everything else, was a process, right? So he did have these amazing 11 volumes worth of diary, and it's the kind of diary where he didn't just say, good weather today, had lunch with Mr. Smith. I mean, he wrote down what he felt and what he saw, and it's the most revealing kind of diary. So he had, in and of itself, this sort of wonderful material. But he had a newspaper column, he had a wide correspondence, he was a poet. So all of that
That's
in
in
and of
here.
itself, yeah, I get some of his poetry in
Yes,
the
you
book
do.
for sure. So in and of itself, he had a lot of different ways in which he was communicating what he did. But as with everything else in the book, he might give me some wonderfully subtle kind of personal view of something, but I still had to go out and figure out another way to get at it from another point of view.
It's interesting. I had a document in here not long ago, a guy named Tultevel, Peter Tultevel. Turns out that he had a connection to both Lincoln and to Booth.
Wow.
He had the Star Saloon that was right next door to Ford's Theater. But in the beginning of the war, he was a musician in the Marine Corps band, and he played for Lincoln at the first inauguration.
Wow.
And he must have seen Lincoln, and maybe Lincoln even saw him.
Wow.
And then, of course, the Star Saloon, as the owner, and he had to testify afterward, he gave Booth his last drink before he went off to do the deed.
Wow.
So French also has a connection to both Lincoln as commissioner of buildings and to Booth.
Indeed. So, and he writes about this in his diary. So he was commissioner of public buildings, and he also was in charge of orchestrating the inauguration. And he writes in his diary about how he was overseeing everything, and he had heard rumors that there might be someone trying to do something to Lincoln. He didn't know what, and he was whisking Lincoln around to try and prevent anything bad from happening. But he describes, during the inauguration, seeing someone come out of the crowd, upset and seemingly really entitled, acting as though he's very entitled to get in, to be in the circle with Lincoln. And the way that French tells it, he was so insistent, and he seemed so sure of himself and entitled that French initially thought, oh, he must be a member of Congress I haven't met before. But then, in the end, he says, no, something about this isn't right, and he's held back long enough that Lincoln passes by. Not long thereafter, when events unfold the way that they unfold, and he manages to see what Booth looks like, he realizes to his astonishment that probably that was Booth who he stopped and held back at that earlier point from doing Lincoln damage. So yeah, that stunned the heck out of him.
I wonder if Booth really had a plan, if he was going to do it right there. How would he get away? The theater, he had a better chance, and he did get away.
Yeah.
Although he was in front of some people. And,
Yeah,
and he
just
knew
a
he
few.
was. Just very quickly, I noticed in here, there was a photographic album that he kept for his son.
Yeah.
And that's in the Library of Congress. That
Yeah.
must be an interesting album. What did he put in there, just as a quick...
Well, so he was commissioner of public buildings under Lincoln. And so actually he got to know Lincoln, and he was involved in the Lincoln White House. But a lot of what he was doing was overseeing the extension of the Capitol, which was being extended throughout this period. And so the photo album partly has really interesting photos of the building, the enlarging of the Capitol, and horse-drawn carts pulling pillars, and then sometimes, like, he went up to the top of the Capitol and took photographs looking out around at Washington, and those went in the album as well. So he was kind of documenting his job and then kind of documenting Washington in a really wonderful kind of a way.
I think I've seen some of those photographs in stereo views of the day.
Yeah,
I have
probably.
a collection of them right now, actually.
Probably.
Strangely enough. So let's get a little bit into what this book really is.
Okay.
And that is, you found approximately 70 different fight scenes, occurrences that happened in the walls of Congress. First of all, how do you define a true fight besides just verbal assault? How do you find it?
Good question. So by the simple answer of that is that a fight had to be something in which you took some kind of physical action. It wasn't enough to just argue. It wasn't enough to call a name. So canings, fist fights, shoving, punching, big melees, dual challenges, anything that was physical, even lunging, people lunging at each other, even if they didn't really manage to land a punch. There had to be a physical component of it that went beyond just name calling.
Well, you know, the nature of fights was something as well then. Mr. Brooks, I don't have his first name here, in a recent book, Liberty Party, maybe you know it, notes the deliberate and politically strategic provocation of violence in Congress. What's your taking on that? It was positively provoked?
Well, so it was
And maybe
provoked.
the Republicans actually did some of that too?
For sure. So on the one hand, for a time before there were Republicans, the Southerners were far more comfortable with man-to-man violence, so they were really deliberately using it to intimidate Northerners into backing away or being afraid to stand up for whatever it was they wanted, and obviously they were protecting the institution of slavery with it. But there were abolitionists and then ultimately Republicans as well, who, and actually Joshua Giddings with the gunplay incident that I described a little while ago was someone who is famous for this. He would say something deliberately, knowing that it would upset the Southerners, and then when they did what he knew they would do, which is run at him with a cane or begin howling or screaming, he essentially would point to them and say, "Ladies and gentlemen, the barbaric South." Again and again, they kind of played into his narrative. He was a big guy, so he could kind of use that kind of strategy.
Well, as it went along, I'm sure it increased, but what was the percent, you'd think, of those 70 fights that were truly over slavery, the slave issue, as opposed to personal things that did happen as well in Congress? And these are all in the walls of Congress, right?
Correct. Well, some of them were on the streets of Washington.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So some of them got out there.
Yeah.
So what percent would you say were really slavery driven? The majority, I presume.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the majority. Some of the early ones are not so much. Some of the early ones are actually party-based and not slavery-based. So some of the early ones, this is in the early years of the book, is when organized party politics and the rise of Jackson and the Jacksonian Democrats means that politics is kind of team-based or battle-based in a way that it wasn't before. So some of it initially is one party calling the other corrupt and then people taking personal offense and attacking each other. But after a certain time, then yeah, most of the fighting in one way or another has to do with slavery. But you're also right that there are just some of these guys who really hate each other. And for one reason or another, they tick each other off and they set each other off again and again and again.
I just want to go to something on the side for a moment, because political parties, as you mentioned, there were a whole bunch of them, and you list them in your book, and there were a couple there that I had really forgotten about, or maybe didn't even know that were there. So what were the political parties, very briefly, that we contend with in the book?
Well, the main ones in the book are first the Whigs and the Democrats, and then the Republicans come along as the Whig Party fades out of view. So those are the main ones. There are a lot of other parties. I mean,
Did they get involved in these fights as well, or it was just mainly the big guys?
I mean, it was mainly the big guys, but the reason why I list all those parties in the, I guess that's Appendix A and not Appendix B,
right.
Is because the parties, some of them came and went very quickly. There are a lot of them, as you're saying, some of them that are very obscure and they were there for a while and not. And I'm using a variety of different records to label what party they were attached to at any given time, and it changes. So
some were mislabeled.
Right, were in the source that I went to initially were mislabeled, and then you sort of dig around in someone's papers and you realize that they themselves don't consider themselves of that party in that moment. So it was tricky. It was tricky deciding what party affiliation to give people at a given moment. It was sometimes
it was fluid to an extent.
Yeah, it was, and so were sometimes people's sense of region, who was a Westerner or a Southern-born Westerner or a Northern-born Westerner or a Southerner or Northerner. All of that kind of stuff there was some fluidity to it.
Well, you talk about the problems of finding emotion in dry pages. So, especially, for instance, with Wade Chandler, the Cameron story, fascinating story. How did party affiliation impact the emotionness and the willingness to fight?
Well, so that's part of the fact that this is a period when party politics in the way that we kind of take it for granted now is new. So that nowadays, sometimes I think we think of party, well, nowadays maybe nothing is the way we typically think of it, but normally party affiliation didn't have the sort of deeply personal component to it that it did in this early period. Mm-hmm. So that you could, for example, there's a chapter of the book that talks about a duel, a fatal duel between two congressmen, which starts because one congressman stands up and accuses the other party of being corrupt. And someone from that other party is so deeply offended by that he stands up and defends his party, and the person who issued the charge is offended. And there ends up being, through a variety of circumstances, a duel in which someone gets killed, and it begins with Democrats are corrupt, which hardly seems like the sort of thing someone would kill someone over, but there was a deep kind of personal attachment to party in this period, and in politics in this period as well, so that some of the fighting that I'm talking about, you can't separate personal honor, party politics, policy, they're all kind of bound together in one big bundle of angst.
Let's talk about the South's code of honor and the honor culture. It was interesting. Just today, this morning here in the shop, a couple from North Carolina came in, and I was showing them the book. They actually bought it.
Yay!
And we talked about some of the issues and started that. And she brought up honor. Why did it happen in the South? I was asking. Honor. She came right out with it. She said also religion a little bit. It seems that her great-grandfather had been a Quaker, and he was from Virginia, and left his wife and 12 children to fend for themselves, and he went out to Texas to stay away from the war. He was a Quaker.
Wow.
He didn't want to be taken in.
Wow.
So anyway, how did this, what do I want to say? I want to know about the code of honor, why I grew up in the South. Maybe they were too Scottish.
Well, I think, so when you go back in time before the period covered in this book, actually the period covered in my first book, Affairs of Honor, part of what that talks about is that there were different understandings of personal honor in the North and the South, so it's not as though it was purely a Southern thing, nor was dueling only a Southern thing, but over time, and this becomes,
Hamilton, Burr,
exactly,
Hamilton's son, for heaven's
exactly.
sakes.
Well, exactly, and the
Francis
first
Scott
book
Key.
talks about 10 or 12 duels that just happened in New York City around or affairs of honor. They don't all go to the dueling ground, but still, there were lots of honor disputes, and particularly among the political elite. Over time, what happens is that dueling, the practice of dueling, becomes seen as more and more inherently Southern. Southerners really kind of take pride in it, and the code of honor is the very ritualized kind of strict code that was more than anything else about having people be able to negotiate out of a duel, right? So that you could get into a duel in the sense that you need to redeem your reputation, you need to redeem your honor, you need somehow or other you feel that you need to prove that you're willing to die to protect your reputation. But it's possible to do that without actually fighting the duel. And so the code of honor was one way to sort of help you use the circumstance to redeem your reputation without hopefully shedding blood or dying. But by the 1830s, 1840s, it's really becoming seen increasingly as Southern. Northerners increasingly are calling it barbaric and Southern and bloody. The North is violent, but they're violent in different ways than the South. And obviously the institution of slavery all by itself requires a certain amount of violence. So honor culture and dueling sort of fit in with the South. But there's still a sense of honor in the North. Benjamin Brown French talks a couple of times, and I quote him at least once in the book, talking about Yankee honor.
Oh, yes.
So there is honor, it's just the code of honor, as you're suggesting. By this period, it's seen as a Southern thing, and dueling is seen as mostly a Southern thing.
While you're talking, I'm thinking about one Abraham Lincoln. I don't know why. But,
strange.
But he had an almost duel. I was talking about talking him their way out. They would still go there, and he was going to have a duel with James Shield. Both of them came from Kentucky. And I wonder if his mother's milk, he got some of that, even in Kentucky, that code of honor that he brought into Indiana, then Illinois. And, but of course, a broadsword was how he got out of it,
right?
Instead of talking. But I'm just kind of wondering about that. So, are there remnants of the honor culture today? Do you think they're still there? I mean, she came out immediately with honor.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the idea of honor, of personal honor, and needing to protect your personal honor, and sort of related to that, reputation, defending your reputation, worrying about your reputation. I think that's very alive today, and I think social media and things like that, the fact that things can spin out of control in a way that you don't have control over them, right, makes personal reputation all the more at risk. I mean, the same people who are worried about privacy and what happens to our private information, reputation is kind of bound up with that problem as well.
And technology has made it a little different with an AK-47 instead of a knife or a fist or something.
That's
so
true.
It makes it more difficult. John Quincy Adams is in this book, and
Yes.
a favorite of mine, actually. And you write of the gag rule, the anti-dueling law, and John Quincy Adams talking about violence in Congress.
Yeah.
What was his role in this story, and is he instructive for today?
Well, so I loved writing about him too. So I have to say, I became a John Quincy Adams fan just in having to deal with and figure out the logic of his campaign against the gag rule that was silencing discussion of anti-slavery petitions in Congress. The thing about him, and the reason why he was so fascinating to me, is by the time he goes back to the House after being president, he's elderly, he's an older fellow by that time, he's an ex-president, and he's the son of an ex-president who's also a founder. You can't beat up John Quincy Adams. He was sort of, fist-proof in addition to being bulletproof in this time period. And he knew that. So he played that. He was really aggressive and really provocative, very deliberately so, essentially saying, bring it to the Southerners, knowing that they couldn't punch him. And some of them even say so. There was a fellow from Virginia named Henry Wise who was particularly dead set against getting at Adams. And at one point he says, if you weren't who you are, you would feel more than the mere power of my words. He's just itching to punch him. And Adams, in his diary that night, writes, oh, Henry Wise threatened to kill me in my seat today. Oh, how nice is that? So he uses that to his benefit. He's anti-slavery, but he's very aware of the fact that some Northerners are not as aggressively anti-slavery as others might be, but
Like Abraham Lincoln?
like many, many of them, right? But they would be very concerned with their rights being violated. And he centers on Southerners silencing Northerners and advertises that as a violation of free speech, as a violation of the right of petition, knowing that Northerners will get extremely upset if they feel that their rights are being violated in that way. And he's right.
Well, I mean, it seems just like election day, voter registration being suppressed.
Right.
And many of us got a little agitated about that.
I think it is eternally true that if your rights, your constitutional rights, are being violated, you should be upset.
And the other thing is that which is today really, is the mutual trust is being eroded.
Right.
And it did then all the way to Civil War.
Right.
I sometimes today wonder, I mean, could we get to that point where mutual trust is so difficult that, you're ready to kill your neighbor just like in Bleeding Kansas?
Well, I'm not going to say that. But what I will say is that you're absolutely right that mutual trust of Americans in each other and trust of Americans in institutions of government are crucial. And you can see how that's true by the time you get to the point in this book when they're beginning to decay. You have, by the period where this book ends, right before the Civil War, most congressmen are armed. And they're armed not because they want to gun down somebody else, but they're afraid that other people are going to want to hurt them. So they are no longer trusting Congress to protect them, and they're no longer even trusting their colleagues not to attack them depending on how circumstances go. So it's hard for a government to function under those kinds of circumstances.
This is one, you can look, depends which way you're looking at it. Did the broader culture and society reflect Congress, or was Congress just reflecting what was going on out in the broad culture?
Well, I think in many ways Congress was representative, right? America was really violent in this time period in any number of ways. I mean, you had, the slaughter of Native Americans, you had the institution of slavery, politics was inherently violent in this period. You had mobbing and riots during elections, people being killed routinely during elections. So certainly some of what I talk about in the book is like, the United States in the 1830s and 1840s, that's what it was like, for sure. So some of it's inherent, but also some of what's going on in Congress is happening because the people doing it in Congress kind of know that they have the support of the folks back home for doing it. I mean, Henry Wise, the John Quincy Adams attacker, at one point someone tries to shame him and says something like, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. We ought to send you out of here for the kind of behavior you do. And Wise essentially responds by saying, yeah, you do that. I'm going to be immediately reelected because my people put me here to do exactly what I'm doing. And he's right, because he's reelected 6 times to Congress at an age when there are a lot of one-term wonders in Congress. So yeah, he's put there by people who are happy to see him standing up for their rights in the way that he does.
So as much as fighting, bullying is a large part of this book as well.
Right, absolutely.
And you see that too. But over time, you're saying, over the decades, the North began to respond to that.
Right.
In their own right. You touched on that a bit, but it took them time to finally do that, yes?
Right. So, and it partly has to do with the intensification of the slavery problem, particularly in the 1850s, when you have the Compromise of 1850, but then the problem of Kansas comes about, and the Kansas crisis means suddenly everything's off the table, who knows what's going to happen, and Northerners begin to feel that Southerners are trying to spread slavery everywhere. Southerners think that Northerners are trying to eliminate it. You get all kinds of conspiracy theories in the press, and that's the moment when you have the birth of what is the Republican Party, which is a Northern anti-slavery party. The fascinating thing about them is, and certainly it's not new, like historians have written for a very long time about the fact that the Republican Party rose to power advertising themselves as the party that was going to fight the slave power. Well, in Congress, that's literal. In Congress, they're fighting the slave power in a really literal kind of a way, and that's part of what I write about in the book.
We got a question from Jake in Sacramento. Thank you, Jake, for listening and for participating as well. And it was something I was going to, when I said Bleeding Kansas, in my notes here, I also put on John Brown. And that's what Jake is asking. Do you think that John Brown was inspired by the example of violent politicians in Washington? And he went out and did it because it was action for what they were saying. And certainly the Republicans were also aggressively goading the other side.
Right. That's a really good question. I would say that certainly he was affected, among other things, with the caning of Sumner. I mean, he was profoundly offended by what he saw. But yeah, I think if you are a strong proponent, you have a deep, almost spiritual belief in what you're doing, and you can see essentially warfare over it happening in the People's Branch, yeah, how is that not going to influence you? Yet I don't have him on paper saying, I saw so-and-so slug thus and such today and decided to go out. But yeah, he was outraged, like many people were, and like many Northerners were, about what they were seeing on the floor of Congress.
You know, like fluoride in the water, it was in the air.
It's true.
Now there were numbers of, let's get into some of the standout fights that were that populate this book. It's such fun. Of course, we all know the Brooks Sumner caning. I mean, that came out. Why is that so remembered and others were not, besides just oppression perhaps? But why does that today, you say that to many people, even the few on the street, they'd understand what you're saying?
Oh no, that's true. So, you know, it took me 17 years to write the book. And in those 17 years, I would say 99.999% of the time, when I said to people, I'm writing a book on violence in Congress, they would say, oh, there was that guy, right? They wouldn't even know the name, but they would know the Sumner. Some of that has to do with the impact it had at the time. Now, I think people often assume that the caning of Sumner had an impact because it was violent. Clearly, based on what I'm saying here, it's not the simple fact of its violence alone that made it have the impact it did. It was partly the timing of it. There had been a number of other violent attacks on Northerners before that point. It was partly the symbolism of it. You know, typically speaking, if you wanted to stage a deliberate physical attack against somebody, you didn't do it in the House or Senate chamber. You might erupt, you might run at somebody, you might, you know, run at them with a cane, but if you were going to do like what Preston Brooks wanted to do, which is deliberately go over to Sumner and then aggressively beat him, you tended to do that outside. And in the aftermath of the caning, people even said, if he'd done it outside, it wouldn't have been such a big deal. And Brooks waited on the Capitol grounds for 2 days to catch Sumner outside before he finally just gave up and went into the Senate. So the symbolism of a senator being beaten to the ground brutally by a Southerner, obviously that had a huge emotional impact on Northerners who were watching and on Southerners as well, who felt like they liked what he did. They felt that he was defending the South as the South should be defended. So I think on both sides, it had a powerful emotional impact that it's hard to exaggerate that when you read. For example, I sat for a while and read the letters written to Sumner after the caning, and the degree to which people were virtually sobbing on the paper in outrage, it would be hard to exaggerate that.
And it wasn't caught on camera. The Chili Graves duel was important in this book. Give us the import and how that affects the book as well.
Absolutely. So that's the only fatal congressional clash. Takes place in 1838 between Jonathan Silly, who is from Maine.
Silly,
No one ever knows how to say it.
Yeah.
It is actually the Silly Graves duel.
Silly. Okay, I remember that.
So yes, so Jonathan
Didn't
Silly
seem
is
so
from
silly
Maine.
to Graves.
I know, it was definitely not silly. And William Graves of Kentucky. What's striking about it, and the reason why I ended up focusing a chapter on it, is they liked each other fine. They were not angry at each other, really. They had nothing against each other. They get pulled into fighting by party politics, by their dedication to their party, by the community of Congress, by their concerns about standing up for the reputation of their constituents in their part of the country. All of these things kind of suck them into having to be involved in a duel that I call in the book the duel that no one wanted. No one wanted this duel to happen, and yet it happened anyway, and someone was killed. And so I use it as an example of the power of the many things that pushed these men into being violent. It's a great example of that because, as people at the time said, there kind of wasn't a reason why, seemingly wasn't a reason why it needed to happen, and yet no one could find a way out.
Did that have broader implications as you went along in time?
Well, certainly for some Northerners, and Benjamin Brown French is one of them, on the one hand, he was really, until the end and the death, he was really excited and encouraged that a Northerner was standing up for himself before the Southerners. And he was like many other Northerners that way. They were like, yeah, Yankee honor. They're standing up for themselves. That was fine. When it actually progressed to the dueling ground, then it wasn't fine at all. So on the one hand, it was encouraging and I think sparked a little something in Northerners to feel that they were glad people were defending their interests, but it certainly didn't do anything to act against the general horror in the North of dueling.
It's interesting that there were the galleries, the congressional galleries came out to watch, like a spectator sport. It reminded me of going to a fight and a hockey game breaks out. So it's the same thing. You're out there, you come to see a fight, legislation sometimes breaks out, but
yeah.
That's what you're there for. Huh?
Yeah, I even actually at some point say in the book that going to watch Congress was somewhat similar to going to watch a hockey game, and that there's going to be some violence, but you don't expect people to kill each other, really. There was something similar, so yeah. And that was a thing that people did routinely in Washington. They went to the galleries to watch the debates. And as congressmen say over and over and over again, if people thought there was going to be an outburst of violence or a really nasty confrontation or a bad argument, they would come in huge numbers, waiting, sort of in the galleries, peering over the edge, waiting for the sort of spicy stuff to break out on the floor.
Yeah, well, spicy stuff is always, like
a draw,
honey.
yeah.
And it was, for instance, at the execution, the trial of the conspirators who killed Lincoln, and newlyweds, strangely enough, went to this. It was kind of a draw for them for some reason. I don't want to even think about why.
No.
The Benton Foote, oh my gosh, Henry Foote, he was ready for it all the time. So Benton Foote, well, tell us, our audience probably doesn't know of this one.
Yeah, and this is a dramatic one. So this takes place in 1850, and Henry Foote and Thomas Hart Benton are essentially both Southerners. They have very different views on what the compromise of 1850 should be. Foote really hates Benton. Benton is a long-term congressman.
Thomas Hart Benton.
Long-term congressman, has a sense of himself as being the sort of master of the Senate. Henry Foote can't stand him. But Henry Foote, who wants his own kind of deal to be made, sets out to, in one way or another, humiliate or take down Benton so that his views and his desires will be destroyed. And he does that in a number of ways, but partly by deliberately provoking Benton. And he knows or assumes that Benton is not a dueling kind of an individual, and he keeps forcing again and again Benton to say, will you duel me or not? Like he'll say, you are a coward, or whatever is the insult he'll throw at Benton. And then he'll say, so, are you a fighting man? Are you going to do anything about what I just said to you or not, Mr. Benton? And Benton is, it's a way of proving that he's not a real Southerner if he's not going to stand up to Foote. Puts Benton in this difficult situation, and he does that a couple of times, and then finally Benton just loses control over it and lunges at Foote, Foote, meanwhile, knowing that sooner or later this was not going to lead to a happy moment, had armed himself with a pistol. So when Benton, with great drama, apparently throws back the chair, flips the desk, things go flying, runs at Foote, Foote pulls the gun and points it at Benton, and Benton bares his chest and says, "Let the assassin fire, let the assassin fire," which there's a meaning to that because he was showing he wasn't armed. So it wasn't a fair fight.
You know, I should have done this beforehand, thank you, but I don't have it in front of me. It was a great
it's a
cartoon of that came out at the
chapter
time,
5,
right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to try to find it right now. It won't work.
But there is a cartoon,
yes.
and it shows him baring his chest
Yes, right.
and Foote
And
facing
Foote.
him, and then the people in the galleries throwing their umbrellas in the air and racing in
Yeah, it's
various
a great
directions.
cartoon.
Yeah.
You got to look at the book to know that, to read it. And there are all sorts of tidbits like this that you're going to find throughout this book that will keep you going. The narrative is quick. It keeps going. It got me. I wanted to know what the next episode was going to be and why and what it meant as well. Now there were 70 fights, and we just talked about 3 of them. Are there some that are really unknown until we read this that are unique or an interesting story that you'd like to share with our viewers?
Gosh. Well, I mean, there are a number of
There's
them.
so many, I know.
I know there are many of them. I mean, the one that just popped into my head takes place in the 1840s, I believe. And it's interesting to me because it reveals something that you might not normally think of. So there's a brawl, and there are multiple congressmen involved in the brawl, and in that sense it's kind of typical. They're on the floor of the House kind of smacking each other around. But what's interesting about this one is someone runs down from the gallery into the House, and he's armed with a gun, and he shoots it. And he's aiming at a congressman, but he actually hits a police officer, a Capitol policeman, in the leg. What's interesting about that is the congressmen were routinely worried that armed people from the galleries would get riled up by the debates and run onto the floor. They were very worried about it. They talk sometimes about who's in the galleries. In the 1850s, they mention it in their letters a number of times. What happens if the people in the galleries get upset and run onto the floor? What do we do? Which is, again, something you would not normally think about, but they were certainly thinking about it.
Would you contextualize all of this once for us and what the broader then meaning of all that was happening, all these events and imbroglios that were happening inside the walls, and how they did help lead to actual civil war, that they just could not get away from each other. And it's not only the code of honor on one side, power politics, of course, is part of it, and also one Abraham Lincoln who put his foot down, a red line. There will not be nationalization of slavery, even though as president-elect, his party was railing against him. Hey, there's going to be secession. Well, he said, well, let the war come. He felt that there was no other way out of the whole slavery issue without that. As an aside, do you think the war could have been averted, or would it have just been kicked down the road? That's why I think Lincoln was so important, because he said, do it now. It's not going to get better, and let's do it now.
Well, the problem of slavery was not solved by compromises, right? The whole 19th century is a series of compromises on slavery that don't work. No. So, can I say definitively that it would or wouldn't have happened? I don't know, but I can say the idea that you could somehow compromise on it and make it okay does not seem likely to me in that sense.
Another question I want to ask as an historian is that why did the Northern soldier fight for Union? I mean, they were ready to die for this concept. I can see many reasons why the Southern soldier, even though they may not be slaveholders themselves, would fight for the honor, for the power that their states have, for the culture, all of that even they on the low end were based on. But the Northern soldier, it was, even though Abner Doubleday wrote, I had a letter of his at the beginning of the war saying, anyone who thinks that this war is not about slavery is a fool. And it was about slavery, but that's not why the Northern soldier usually went in. Why did they vote for it? Why did they
I don't think you can separate them. I think, and this is one of the things that Benjamin Brown French shows. Mm-hmm. From the minute he gets to Washington, he's worried about the Union. He's thinking about the Union. And we take it for granted, right? We assume that, of course, there's a union of states. That's what the United States is. We don't consider it to be fragile or shaky. We don't assume that there's going to be immediate disunion. This was no assurance. They didn't have that in this time period. And French is constantly, and so is everyone else, worried about the Union, thinking about the Union. The Union is like an almost holy thing to
They're
him.
closer to the revolution at that time.
I suppose, yeah. I mean, but in this period, so the Union has been in existence long enough that, in the 1790s, they really did think like one stupid decision and it's all going down. In this period, they're not quite at that point of fragility, but still, French's absolute love of the Union and his dire sense that it needed to be protected, it was huge, and you can feel it throughout the entire book. And that ultimately is his guiding force. Now, he also is grappling with the issue of slavery. He changes his view on that. Initially, he doesn't want to talk about it because he thinks it's going to endanger the Union, and then ultimately comes to a point where he realizes it has to be dealt with. But again, he's still thinking about the Union, worrying about the Union. So I think part of the answer to your question is Union meant something really different in this time period than we assume it means today.
Yeah, that's an interesting answer. Now, at the outbreak of war, violence in Congress lessened greatly, mainly because the South wasn't there, perhaps.
Right.
There still was some violence in there, but not the same sort by any means. But it remained in the Confederate Congress.
I know, yeah. And the same people who are fighting in Congress in Washington, a lot of them go down to the Confederate Congress, and Henry Foote is fighting all over the place in the Confederate Congress. So yeah, they go to the Confederate Congress and are still using violence to engage in politics.
And was there fighting back to that, the way the northern congressmen finally had to fight back? Was there that sort of thing that happened in the Confederate Congress as well?
Well,
really
Southerners were for sure fighting Southerners in the Confederate Congress.
Yeah.
So that was certainly happening down there. I mean, there's something kind of comical about it, that especially Henry Foote, who actually the best sort of violent moment in the Confederate Congress is Henry Foote gets attacked by someone who has a knife. And when the fellow with the knife is held down so that he's no longer dangerous, Foote pulls a Benton, and he opens his jacket and says, "Let the assassin, let him go, let him," which of course, there's no risk that assassin is going to come and get at him, but I love the fact that he recreates the sort of Benton drama moment.
Did some of his colleagues laugh at that one, knowing
I don't
where
know,
it
but
came
it's hard
from?
to imagine that there was not someone somewhere laughing at that for sure.
Yeah, I would think so too. As we've intimated here and there in our conversation, it's difficult not to think of today. And you're not writing about today, you're not going to that area, but you can't not think about the relevance of this to today and how violence provoked, the Civil War. We're not going to have a Civil War here. Sorry about that with my sound, but nonetheless, I hope we don't do that, but it has provoked violence, as we've seen, not in maybe Congress, although there's violence there too of a different sort, but it's not with going out and slaughtering.
Right.
And so do the times provoke society and those in society? We talked about John Brown for a moment. Many of these people, some of these people today might think they're the John Brown of whatever they're thinking about.
Well, I do think, and you're right, that the book is about the 1830s, 40s, and 50s.
Right.
And it took me 17 years, so 17 years ago, politics was very different from how it is now. That said, I finished the book in this climate, and for that reason, it was sometimes really, really hard to write. There's an author's note at the beginning that talks a little bit about this, because there were times when I just had to walk away because I would be watching the news and then I would sit down and the link between the two would be too powerful and it would be too upsetting and I had to not work on the book for a little while. Certainly, I think there are moments in American history, and now is one, and the 1850s were one, the 1790s, the late 1790s were one, the 1960s were one, when different Americans have a different sense of the two different paths that people might travel down. And during those kinds of moments, things get polarized and passions get intense.
I'm going to ask you real quickly to go to the Xerox machine, and on there I have upcoming shows. Sorry, this is making sausage right in front of you, but while she's getting that for me so I can tell about upcoming shows.
It's important to do.
Yes, it's important to do. Is there anything that we've missed that you want the viewers to know about your book and how to maybe approach it or what to try to get out of it?
Well, I think that some of what the book is trying to do is to get at the coming of the Civil War, the road to Civil War, in a different kind of a way. I talk in the book about what I call the emotional logic of disunion. I want people to be able to get down on the ground with people in Congress and with other kinds of Americans and really understand how people came to turn against each other in this way. Benjamin Brown French, at the beginning of the book, is willing to do anything to appease Southerners. Don't talk about slavery. I love the Southerners. Let's just make everything work out. And by the end of the book, he buys a gun prepared to shoot Southerners. And part of what I want the book to do is explain, how do you go from point A to point B? That's a dramatic change. How do you become a person who's prepared to inflict that kind of violence on other Americans? So that's part of what I try to get at by looking at the violence that's happening in Congress.
Was French introspective at all? Did he see what was happening around him and how he was changing himself?
Yes. He's wonderful. Wherever you are, Benjamin Brown French, thank you. Yeah, he's very introspective. He has a sense of humor and some self-awareness. I talk a little bit at the beginning of the book about the many ways in which he's kind of ideal as a narrator-ish kind of guide. So yeah, he is, and he acknowledges over the course of the book, you hear him kind of, and particularly by the end of his life, the book ends with him looking back over his life, and he can very much see over time how the nation changed and how he changed.
Well, a fascinating book, and I think you will love the read, especially after seeing this, or read the book first and then go back to this again. We have some upcoming shows that I'd like you to know about. We have on November 13th at noon Central Time. This is all on our website, authorsvoice.net, and you can always see upcoming shows there. If you forget what I'm going to say, go straight to the website and you'll see what's coming. On November 13th at noon Central Time, we're going to have Solved, our mystery show, but the author and host, both Libby Fisher-Hellman, will be interviewed by another of our hosts, and that's Sonali Dev, about Hellman's High Crimes, Libby's latest crime thriller. So November 13th at noon. But then we're going to have a second show right after that at 2 p.m. Central on November 13th. And Sonali Dev will now do another hosting job, and that will be for Sally Kilpatrick about her latest romance novel, Oh My Stars. So again, that's on Tuesday, November 13th for Solved and also Lit with Love. Ask a question, of course, and you can order a signed book at authorsvoice.net. And if you're watching this after this broadcast on YouTube, you can certainly still order a signed book, and there's a link under the title for you to be able to do that. This is our book. I think you're going to like it. And get a signed first edition. It's a wonderful thing to have on your shelf. So this is Field of Blood, Violence in Congress and the Road to Civil War. 450 fairly quick pages, a wonderful underbook. The footnotes are fascinating, and I enjoyed getting into that as well.
Thank you.
And it was like William Sapphire's Lincoln book. I think maybe about a third of it was an underbook. And it was...
Well, it was a mystery. Piecing all this together was hard, and so I wanted to leave a trail.
And you did, and it's worth reading and getting into that as well. And it's $28 plus shipping, and we'll get it right out to you. Joanne Freeman, thank you so much for being here with us and coming up with this great book. We'll look for the next one, and we'll put you again right here.
Thank you.
I want to thank our staff at Author's Voice. We can't do this, as you know, without them, and also at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. And of course, all of you out there in Webland, we thank you for watching us and being a part and interacting and supporting by purchasing signed first editions from us. Thank you for watching.